In this video, we'll be covering dates and times. So the first thing that we need to do is import the datetime module. So I'm going to go ahead and import both the datetime and the date from datetime. And so let's get the current date. So I'm going to set a variable to current, and we can just call the datetime now method. And if we save our file and run it, so we're going to get a current date along with the hours, minutes, seconds, and then milliseconds. Now we can do something very similar with the date. Instead, we will be calling the today function for if the object is going to be a date object. Then if we rerun our file, obviously we're not going to have the hours, minutes, seconds, and milliseconds. So it just depends on how granular you need when it comes to the date and time as to which one of these you would use. We can also declare a specific date time. So let's go ahead and create a new variable. And so we're just going to pass in some parameters. The first one is going to be the year, followed by the month and the date. Let's go ahead and print that. Notice that we only passed in the year, followed by the month, followed by the day. So since we did not pass anything in terms of the time, it's going to use the default, which is going to be all zeros. So we can pass in hours, minutes, and seconds. We just have to add more parameters. Actually, let's print that out. Okay, so when we go ahead and print that out, those are all of our values. It does give us basically a 0 before each one of the numbers if they're less than 10. And we can do something very similar with the date module. And we save that and run it. Obviously, that's all we're going to get is the date. So next thing I'm going to do is go ahead and import the time delta object. So that basically tracks differences between two dates and times. So if I set a new variable next year, so we're going to take our current date and we're going to add 365 days to that. And let's go ahead and rerun our code. And we get a value of next year, so 2018, 12/25. And we can also grab dates from strings. So let's go ahead and create a new variable. And we'll call this datetime object from string. So we need to set our datetime object, and so the method that we'll be calling is string ptime. So I'll set that to, 1/1/2001. And so the next item is going to be the formatter, what format that we want to use. And this is going to be the C standard datetime format placeholders. So they all start with a percentage. So %M will be the month, followed by %D for the day. And %Y, that's going to give us a 4-digit year. And let's go ahead and print that out. Okay, so once we put that in, we have basically a new datetime Python object. And let's go ahead and do one more. This time we're going to pass in some values for the hours, minutes, and seconds. So we'll just say 12 o'clock. And so we need to go back to our formatter and then put in the placeholders for those. And then if we rerun that, we have our date plus our hours, minutes, and seconds. We can also grab the date and time objects from a datetime object. So let's go ahead and create a new variable. We'll call this sDate. So we need to grab our datetime object and call the date method. So we go ahead and print this out. We basically changed to a different data type. And so we have a class of date, and then so anything holding the hours, minutes, and seconds is basically just going to get dropped. And we can do the same thing with the time. Actually, what I'll do is just copy all of this. And then we need to call the time method. And so basically the date portion got dropped. So we have a class of time, and then the only thing that we're storing in that variable is the time itself. And so moving on to the instance methods that come with the datetime objects, what we can do is, so we can use a specific formatter. So let's go ahead and print, let's use our specific datetime once again. So we're going to use stirf time. And then so what we need to do is first pass in our, what format we want this. So let's go %m, %d, so month, day, and then a 4-digit year, which is capital Y, followed by our hours, minutes, and seconds. If we save that and run it, so we basically have a more human readable date time. There's also, if we just need the ISO format, this is very common if we're returning data in like a JSON formatted data or exporting it. ISO format's pretty common, and there's a method just for that. And so our typical ISO format, we have the capital T that separates the date and the time. A couple of other instance methods, we can grab the day of the week. So we'll grab the weekday. So we can call the weekday method, but keep in mind this is 0 based. So 5 is actually going, so 0 is Monday, so 5 is actually going to be a Saturday. And if so, if we want it to be 1 base with Monday starting with number 1, we would have to call ISO weekday. So the index value is going to change for the day of the week number. It just depends on what your use case is. But either one of those basically translates to a Saturday. And there's also another method called ISO calendar. And that's going to return us a couple useful things. And what we're getting back is a tuple. So the first one is obviously the year. The second one, that is the month of the year. So the 45th month, followed by the day. The day being 1 based. So Saturday. So another important issue, we covered on this a little bit earlier, is the time delta. So I'm just going to go ahead and create a new time delta. And set that to days equals 365. And then we can figure out, so it's basically the difference between one date and another. And then so we can grab the total seconds, which looks like it's 31,536,000 seconds in a year. So we can also create a diff object and subtract. Remember earlier we made a next year variable, and then we want to subtract the current date. So let's go ahead and display that. And notice that, so when we subtract two datetime objects, what we're going to get is this is going to be a time delta object. So our diff variable is actually this time delta object right here. And then when we just print it, it's just going to give us these standard days. It's kind of context dependent. But if we want to calculate, something that we're going to use later, we can always use the total seconds and then have a helper function with the total seconds. But since it's a full year, it knows to just give us a days to print that out. So another issue that we have to address commonly is time zones. And most of this will be covered in a future video because there's a couple of external libraries that you commonly see with handling the different time zones. But there's, in the standard library, the standard date time object, there's some functionality for time zones. It's not very much, and for most applications it's not enough, but we're just going to cover that really quick. So let's go ahead and get the current time zone. So we can call tzinfo or tzinfo property, and this is basically our current date and time. And if we run that, we'll notice that none is set. So this is basically a naive date in that there's no time zone information that was originally set with it. So one thing that if we want to use the standard library to handle this, what we can do is we can call the replace method. So we're going to use the tzinfo param and just call this timezone.utc. Then let's go ahead and reprint this line, and we save it and run it. Okay, so what we need to do is import time zone from datetime. Okay, let's go back down and try it again. So we originally had none, so it had no notion of what the time zone was. We just fed it a date time. We basically set it to UTC, so now that we have time zone information inside our current datetime object. And so before we finish, the replace method is how you typically modify a date. So let's go back to our specific date time. Recall that was set to November 12th, 2011, a little after 3 o'clock. So let's go ahead and change that. And so we need to call the replace method on our existing date time. And we can change the month to December, and minute, it's actually going to be minute. And change that to 15. Okay, and then that changes our date and time from November to December, and then I think we were at 3:01. Yeah, 3:01 originally. Now we're at 3:15. So this pretty much wraps up the first video on dates and times. In future videos, what we're going to be covering is a couple of libraries to help us with different time zones and things like that. Thanks for watching.